Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
When I got the call saying my dad had been rushed to the hospital, my world stopped. They told me he had a heart condition, and if I wanted to see him, I needed to come home now. I dropped everything, packed up my life, and moved back. But after a few weeks, I started noticing things that didn't add up. It wasn't long before I realized the health scare was a lie, and my dad had a completely different plan for me. It was a quiet Thursday evening when my phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number, but something told me to answer it. "Hello?" I said, pressing the phone to my ear. "Is this my name?" a frantic voice asked. "Yes, who's this?" "This is Mrs. Reynolds, your dad's neighbor. I'm so sorry to bother you, but your dad was just taken to the hospital. He collapsed in the backyard, and the ambulance had to take him away. The doctors think it's a severe heart condition. You need to come home. If you want to see him, you should come as soon as you can." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. My dad and I weren't particularly close, but he was still my dad. I'd been living halfway across the country for years, focused on building my career and carving out a life for myself. The idea of him being seriously ill, or worse, was almost too much to process. "What hospital?" I asked, my voice shaking. "St. Mary's," she said. "Please hurry." I hung up and stared at the wall for a moment, my heart pounding. My job, my apartment, my entire life. It all felt distant and insignificant compared to the thought of losing him. Without thinking twice, I emailed my boss requesting emergency leave, started packing, and was on the road within hours. The drive was grueling. 12 hours of endless highways and too much time alone with my thoughts. Memories of my dad kept flashing through my mind. His gruff laugh, the way he always called me kiddo, and the time he taught me to ride a bike by letting go without warning and cheering as I wobbled down the street. By the time I arrived at the hospital, I was exhausted, emotionally and physically. I rushed to the front desk and asked for his room number. "Room 217, the nurse said, "but keep your visit brief. He needs rest." I nodded and made my way down the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway, my stomach churning with anxiety. When I finally stepped into his room, the sight of him stopped me in my tracks. He looked smaller somehow, his face pale and lined with exhaustion. An 4 was hooked into his arm, and a heart monitor beeped softly in the background. For the first time in my life, he looked fragile. "Dad," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned his head slowly and gave me a weak smile. "Kiddo," he said, his voice raspy. "You came." "Of course I came," I said, sitting down beside him. "What happened?" He waved a hand weakly, as if trying to brush it off. "Heart," he said simply. "Doctors say it's not good, but I'm glad you're here." In that moment, I didn't question anything. I didn't ask for details or second-guess his condition. I was just relieved he was still alive. The next few days passed in a blur. The doctors kept him under observation, running test after test, while I tried to make sense of the situation. They were vague about his condition, mentioning terms like fatigue and monitoring for complications, but I didn't press them for specifics. Instead, I threw myself into helping where I could. I picked up his prescriptions, stocked the fridge with healthy food, and even cleaned up his house, which had clearly been neglected for weeks. I told myself I'd stay long enough to help him recover, then head back to my life. But as the days turned into weeks, I started noticing things that didn't add up. Little inconsistencies in his story, subtle clues that hinted at a much bigger truth. It wasn't long before I realized that everything I thought I knew about his health scare was a lie. The day my dad was discharged from the hospital felt like a small victory. The nurses handed us a packet of instructions, a list of medications, dietary guidelines, and a vague warning to avoid stress and overexertion. I drove him home, careful to take it slow, and helped him inside. He sank into his old recliner with a sigh, looking worn but content. "Home sweet home," he muttered, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I told myself I'd stay for a few weeks, long enough to help him recover and get back on his feet. After all, this was temporary. My life was waiting for me back in the city, and I wasn't planning to put it on hold for too long. At first, everything seemed normal. I slipped into a routine, making him meals, organizing his medications, and driving him to follow-up appointments. He seemed grateful, thanking me often, and even joking that I should move back permanently. "It's nice having you around," he'd say with a grin. I forgot how much I missed my kiddo. I tried to take it all in stride. This was my dad, after all, and I wanted to help. But as the days turned into weeks, Small inconsistencies began to nag at me. For someone who'd supposedly had a severe heart condition, he was surprisingly spry. Within a week of coming home, he was walking around the house with ease, rearranging furniture, and even working in the garden. At first, I chalked it up to his stubbornness. He'd always been the type to ignore doctor's orders if he thought he knew better. But then there were other things. I caught him sneaking a beer from the fridge one evening, despite the strict no alcohol rule in his discharge instructions. When I confronted him, he laughed it off. "One beer won't kill me," he said. "Besides, the doctors said I should stay active. Doesn't that mean I deserve a little treat now and then?" I didn't argue, but something about his tone felt off. The follow-up appointments didn't provide much clarity, either. Each time, I'd sit in the waiting room while he met with the doctor, only for him to emerge a few minutes later, waving it off like it was nothing. Same old, he'd say. "They just want me to keep taking my meds and rest up." When I asked for specifics, he'd get defensive. "You don't need to worry about the details," he said. "I've got it under control." His dismissiveness started to wear on me. I wasn't trying to micromanage him. I just wanted to understand what was going on. But every time I tried to dig deeper, he'd shut me down with a joke or a change of subject. The turning point came one afternoon when I noticed a stack of unopened mail on the kitchen counter. Most of it was junk, but one envelope caught my eye. It was from the hospital, addressed to him, with discharge summary enclosed, printed on the front. I hesitated for a moment before opening it. The summary was short and clinical, listing his diagnosis and treatment during his hospital stay. My eyes scanned the page, searching for the heart condition he'd been diagnosed with, but it wasn't there. Instead, the summary mentioned mild dehydration and fatigue, both of which had been resolved with fluids and rest. There was no mention of a heart condition, no serious health issues, nothing that matched the dire situation Mrs. Reynolds had described when she called me. I stared at the paper, my mind racing. If this was the truth, then what had all of this been about? Why had I uprooted my life and moved back for a health scare that didn't even exist? That evening, I confronted him. I placed the discharge summary on the table in front of him and crossed my arms. "Care to explain this?" I asked. He glanced at the paper and frowned. "What's there to explain?" "It says you were dehydrated," I said. "That's it. No heart condition, no major health issue, just dehydration." "So why did Mrs. Reynolds call me and say you'd collapsed? Why did I think you were dying?" He shifted in his seat, avoiding my gaze. "Look, I might have exaggerated a little," he admitted, "but I needed you here. You wouldn't have come if I just said I was feeling under the weather." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You lied to me," I said, my voice shaking. "Don't be so dramatic," he replied, waving a hand dismissively. "You're here now, aren't you? And isn't it nice to spend some time together as a family?" I felt a surge of anger and disbelief. This wasn't about his health, it was about control. And in that moment, I realized I'd been manipulated into putting my life on hold for a lie. But I also knew this was just the beginning. If he'd gone to these lengths to get me here, I had to wonder, what else wasn't he telling me? It was a quiet evening, and I was cleaning up after dinner when I noticed a stack of papers on the kitchen table. They looked like medical documents, hospital forms, prescriptions, follow-up appointment slips. At first, I didn't think much of it. My dad had always been disorganized, and the house was constantly cluttered with random piles of mail and paperwork. But something about this stack caught my eye. Maybe it was the envelope labeled discharge summary enclosed, or the fact that it was half open, as if he'd barely glanced at it. Curious, I sat down and began flipping through the papers. The discharge summary was the first thing I read, and it stopped me in my tracks. It was concise, listing his symptoms and the treatment he'd received during his hospital stay. But the words mild dehydration jumped out at me, stark and undeniable. There was no mention of a heart condition, no signs of a life-threatening illness, just dehydration and a recommendation to drink more water. I stared at the paper, my mind racing. This couldn't be right. I'd uprooted my entire life because I thought my dad was seriously ill. The phone call from his neighbor, the hospital stay, the somber look on his face when I arrived. All of it had felt so real. And yet, here it was in black and white. My dad hadn't been on death's door. I flipped through the rest of the papers, searching for some kind of explanation. But everything confirmed what the discharge summary had said. There were no test results pointing to a heart condition, no evidence of the severe diagnosis I'd been led to believe. The longer I looked, the angrier I became. I felt duped, like I'd been dragged into a play where everyone knew their lines except me. If this wasn't about his health, then what was it about? When he came into the kitchen a little while later, I was still sitting there, the papers spread out in front of me. "What's all this?" he asked, his tone casual as he grabbed a soda from the fridge. "That's what I'd like to know," I said, holding up the discharge summary. "Care to explain why it says you were treated for dehydration and nothing else?" His expression froze for a split second before he recovered, plastering on an easy smile. "That must be a mistake," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "The hospital staff is always messing up paperwork. You know how it is." I narrowed my eyes, not buying it. "A mistake?" I repeated. "It doesn't look like a mistake. It looks pretty clear to me." He shrugged, taking a sip of his soda. "What do you want me to say? Maybe they didn't write everything down. I know what the doctors told me, and they said I need to take it easy and avoid stress." I could feel my frustration boiling over. "Dad, I moved across the country because I thought you were seriously ill. Mrs. Reynolds told me you'd collapsed in the backyard, and now you're telling me it was just dehydration." He frowned, his easygoing demeanor slipping for a moment. "Look, I didn't mean to worry you, but it's not like I made her call you. She was probably just scared and overreacted." "Overreacted?" I said, my voice rising. "She told me the doctors said it was a severe heart condition. Was that an overreaction too?" He looked at me for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he sighed and said, "Kiddo, I don't know what to tell you. Maybe things got blown out of proportion. But you're here now, and that's what matters. Let's not dwell on it." His words left me stunned. It wasn't an outright admission, but it wasn't a denial either. It was as if he was trying to sweep the whole thing under the rug, hoping I'd let it go without asking too many questions. But I couldn't let it go. The nagging feeling in my gut was stronger than ever. If his health wasn't as bad as he claimed, then why had he insisted I move back? Why go to such lengths to uproot my life? That night, I lay awake in bed, replaying the conversation in my head. Part of me wanted to confront him again, to demand the truth. But another part of me was afraid of what I might find if I dug too deep. I decided to wait, to watch and see if more cracks would appear in his story. If he'd gone to such lengths to get me here, there had to be more to it. And I was determined to figure out what. In the weeks following the discovery of my dad's discharge summary, things started to shift. He no longer talked much about his supposed heart condition, and I noticed he was more active than ever. He'd spend mornings puttering around the house, organizing his tools, and even mowing the lawn, something I thought was off-limits due to his fragile health. At first, I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he was feeling better. Maybe the doctors had been overly cautious, and now he was just trying to regain a sense of normalcy. But as the days passed, a pattern began to emerge, and it became harder to ignore. The first red flag came when he started making casual comments about how convenient it was to have me around. "It's nice not having to run to the store all the time," he said one evening as I unloaded groceries. "You've got a knack for picking the good stuff. Better than me, that's for sure." At first, I thought it was a compliment, but then he started adding more to my plate. "Hey, kiddo, can you take the car in for an oil change? I do it myself, but, you know, the heart. Or, could you call the insurance company? They've been giving me the runaround, and I just don't have the energy to deal with it right now." Each request seemed reasonable enough on its own, but they added up quickly. Before I knew it, I was running errands, scheduling appointments, and even handling his bills. One day, I came home from a grocery run to find him in the living room with a notebook in hand. He grinned and waved me over. "I made a list," he said cheerfully, handing it to me. I glanced at the notebook, expecting a short to-do list. Instead, it was a detailed breakdown of tasks. Fix the leaky faucet in the kitchen, organize the garage, call the cable company to negotiate a lower bill, deep clean the carpets, and even take the dog to the vet for his checkup. "That's quite a list," I said, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah, but you're so good at getting things done," he said, smiling like it was the biggest compliment in the world. "I figured you could knock it out in no time." That's when it hit me. I wasn't here to help him recover. I was here to be his unpaid help. At first, I tried to broach the subject gently. "Dad, I'm happy to help, but this is starting to feel like a lot," I said one evening after he handed me yet another list of errands. He frowned, clearly annoyed. "I thought you wanted to help me. I mean, after everything I've done for you, the least you can do is lend a hand when I need it." I was taken aback by his tone. "I do want to help," I said, "but this feels more like, I don't know, being a live-in assistant. I thought I was here because you needed support with your health." He crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair. "I do need support. Do you think I enjoy asking for help? It's hard for me, kiddo, but you're my child. Isn't that what family does?" His words felt like a punch to the gut. On one hand, he wasn't wrong. Family is supposed to help each other. But on the other hand, it felt like he was exploiting that bond to manipulate me into staying. The breaking point came a few days later when he asked me to quit my job permanently. "You don't need to go back," he said casually over breakfast. "Your work-from-home setup is great, and you can do that anywhere. Why not just stay here? We make a good team." I stared at him, stunned. "Dad, I can't just uproot my life like that. I came here because I thought you were sick. Now it seems like you're doing fine, but you're asking me to put everything on hold indefinitely?" He shrugged. "What's so great about living out there? You're single, no kids, no mortgage. There's nothing tying you to that city. But here, you've got me. Doesn't that count for something?" I felt my frustration boil over. "It does count, but I can't give up my entire life to be your caregiver."
That's not fair.
His expression darkened. "Caregiver? Is that what you think this is? I just need a little help. You're making it sound like I'm some kind of burden." I shook my head, trying to keep my voice steady. "That's not what I'm saying. But this isn't sustainable, Dad. I can't do everything for you. And I can't stay here forever." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he stood up, muttering something under his breath about how ungrateful I was. That night, I lay awake in bed, replaying the conversation in my head. It was clear now that my dad hadn't just exaggerated his health scare. He'd orchestrated the entire thing to get me to move back. Whether he admitted it or not, he wanted me here not because he needed me, but because it was convenient for him. The realization left me feeling angry and betrayed. But more than that, it made me question everything. How long had he been planning this? And how far was he willing to go to keep me under his roof? I didn't know the answers yet, but one thing was certain. This wasn't just about his health anymore. This was about control. The more I thought about my dad's behavior, the more I realized there were too many unanswered questions. His heart condition didn't make sense, and the discharge summary had confirmed my suspicions. But I needed more than a single document. I needed proof that he had been lying from the start. One morning, after he left for his daily walk, I decided to make a few calls. First, I contacted the hospital where he'd been treated. It took some persistence and a bit of navigating through their bureaucracy, but I eventually managed to speak with someone who could help. "I'm requesting a copy of my father's medical records from his recent hospital visit," I said, trying to keep my tone professional. The woman on the other end of the line paused. "Are you listed as an authorized party?" "Yes," I said, hoping it was true. My dad had always been careless with paperwork, so there was a good chance he hadn't bothered updating his forms in years. After verifying a few details, she finally said, "We can send the records to the email on file. Would that work for you?" "Yes, thank you," I said, barely able to contain my relief. The email arrived later that afternoon. My hands trembled as I opened the attachment, scanning the document for answers. Sure enough, the records confirmed what the discharge summary had already hinted at: dehydration and mild fatigue. No heart condition, no life-threatening illness, just a minor issue that had been resolved within hours of treatment. I stared at the screen, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. He'd lied to me. There was no misunderstanding, no hospital mix-up. He'd fabricated the entire story to get me to move back home. When he returned from his walk, I was waiting for him in the living room, the records printed and laid out on the coffee table. "What's this?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "This," I said, pointing to the papers, "is your medical record. Care to explain why it says you were treated for dehydration and not a heart condition?" His face paled for a moment before he quickly recovered. "Oh, for crying out loud," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "You went through all that trouble for this? You know how hospitals are. They never get anything right." I shook my head, my voice trembling with frustration. "Don't lie to me, Dad. This isn't a mistake. This is the truth. You weren't dying, and you didn't have a heart condition. You made the whole thing up." He sighed, sinking into his recliner. "Fine," he said after a long pause. "I exaggerated a little, but I needed you to come home, and I knew you wouldn't do it otherwise." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You lied to me," I said, my voice rising. "You made me think you were dying. Do you have any idea what that did to me?" "Oh, don't be so dramatic," he said, rolling his eyes. "It's not like I faked a heart attack or anything. I just stretched the truth a bit, I said, my hands clenching into fists. "I moved across the country. I put my life on hold because I thought you were seriously ill. And for what? So you could have someone to run your errands and clean your house?" His expression hardened. "Don't make it sound like I'm some kind of monster. I'm your father, for crying out loud. After everything I've done for you, is it so much to ask for a little help in return?" "That's not the point," I said, shaking my head. You didn't ask. You manipulated me. You lied to me because you knew I'd feel guilty if I didn't come. And it worked, didn't it? He shot back, his tone cold. You're here now. That's what matters. I stared at him, stunned into silence. The man in front of me didn't seem like the father I'd grown up with. The man who taught me to ride a bike, who'd stayed up late helping me with school projects, who'd always told me to be honest no matter what. You don't even feel bad, do you? I said finally. He shrugged. I did what I had to do. If you're upset, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to apologize for wanting my family close. His words hit me like a slap. This wasn't about his health or even about needing help. It was about control. He'd seen me building a life for myself, independent and far away from him, and he couldn't stand it. I got up and walked out of the room, needing space to think. My mind was racing, filled with questions I wasn't sure I wanted the answers to. How long had he been planning this? How far was he willing to go to keep me here? One thing was clear. This wasn't just a web of lies. It was a trap, and I had no intention of staying caught in it. The morning after our confrontation, the tension in the house was palpable. My dad was uncharacteristically quiet, sipping his coffee in the kitchen without his usual cheerful commentary about the news or the weather. I kept my distance, still reeling from the realization of how far he'd gone to manipulate me into moving back home. By lunchtime, the silence broke. You're really upset about this, huh? He said, leaning against the counter as I made myself a sandwich. You think? I replied, not bothering to hide my sarcasm. He sighed and folded his arms. Look, kiddo, maybe I didn't go about things the right way, but I needed you here. And honestly, I don't think that's such a terrible thing. Families are supposed to take care of each other. His tone was soft, almost remorseful, and for a moment, I thought he might actually acknowledge how unfair he'd been. But then he added, do you remember that science fair project in the 5th grade? The volcano? I blinked, caught off guard by the change in subject. Yeah, I remember, I said cautiously. Do you remember who stayed up all night helping you get it right after you forgot to mix the baking soda and vinegar properly? He asked, a small smile tugging at his lips. I stared at him, unsure of where he was going with this. You did, I said slowly. That's right, he said. And do you remember who spent hours teaching you how to parallel park, even though you nearly took out the mailbox 3 times? You did, I repeated, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. And who worked overtime to make sure you could go to that fancy college of yours? Who drove you to your first job interview? Who made you lunch every day in high school? Dad. He held up a hand, cutting me off. I've always been there for you, kiddo. I've done everything I could to give you the best life possible. And now, for the first time, I need you. And you're acting like it's some huge inconvenience. His words stung. They weren't entirely untrue, and that's what made them so hard to argue against. He had been there for me in a lot of ways. He'd sacrificed for me, supported me, and been a good dad in many respects. But this wasn't about returning a favor. This was about manipulation. I'm not saying I don't appreciate everything you've done for me, I said carefully. But what you're asking for now is different. You lied to me, Dad. You made me think you were dying. That's not fair. I didn't lie, he said defensively. I just made sure you understood how important it was for you to come home. That's not the same thing, I shot back. You manipulated me into moving back here, and now you're trying to guilt me into staying. He shook his head, looking genuinely hurt. Manipulation? Guilt? Is that what you really think of me? I'm your father. I shouldn't have to beg for your help. This is what families do. They sacrifice for each other. I stared at him, my frustration bubbling over. It's not a sacrifice if it's forced, Dad. You didn't give me a choice. You tricked me into thinking you needed me, and now you're trying to twist that into some kind of moral obligation. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just looked at me like I'd slapped him. Finally, he said, you know, when your mom left, I didn't complain. I didn't make a fuss. I just kept my head down and did what I had to do to raise you. And now I'm asking for a little help, and you're acting like I've committed some terrible crime. His words hit me like a gut punch. I knew he'd had a rough time after my mom left, and I'd always admired the way he'd stepped up to take care of me. But using that as leverage to justify his behavior now felt like a low blow. This isn't about Mom, I said quietly. This is about you not respecting my boundaries. I'm happy to help you when you need it, but I can't give up my entire life to be your caregiver. That's not fair. And what if I need more than a little help? He asked, his voice rising. What if I can't do this on my own anymore? Am I supposed to just hire some stranger to take care of me while my own daughter is off living her best life? That's not what I'm saying, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But you have to be honest with me about what you need. You can't just trick me into moving back and expect me to drop everything for you. He shook his head, muttering something under his breath about how ungrateful I was. I didn't respond. I was too drained to keep arguing, and I knew nothing I said would change his mind. Over the next few days, the guilt trips continued. He brought up every sacrifice he'd ever made for me, every moment he'd gone above and beyond as a father. At one point, he even showed me a photo album of my childhood, pointing out all the times he'd been there for me. "Do you remember this?" he asked, holding up a picture of us at a theme park. "You were so scared to go on the roller coaster, but I went with you anyway. That's what family does. We faced things together. It was exhausting. No matter how many times I tried to explain my side, he refused to see it. To him, this was simple. He'd been there for me, and now it was my turn to be there for him. No questions asked. I wanted to feel sympathy for him, but all I could feel was frustration. This wasn't about love or loyalty. This was about control, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could take it. The conversation started innocently enough. My dad and I were sitting at the kitchen table, eating dinner. The tension from our recent arguments had settled into an uneasy truce, and we were trying to keep things light. "You know," he said, between bites of lasagna, "it's been nice having you here. Feels like old times." I smiled faintly, not wanting to ignite another fight. "It's been good spending time together," I admitted, though I avoided adding that the circumstances made it bittersweet. He nodded, taking a sip of his drink. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "maybe you should just stay. You're already working from home most of the time, right? You can do that here. There's no reason to go back to the city." I froze mid-bite, my fork hovering over my plate. "Stay?" I repeated, my voice wary. "Yeah," he said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "What's the point of paying rent for some tiny apartment when you've got a whole house here? Plus, you'd save money. It's a win-win." I put my fork down, suddenly no longer hungry. "Dad, I came here because I thought you were sick. I didn't plan to stay permanently." "Well, maybe you should," he said, his tone hardening. "I mean, let's be honest. What's out there for you? Really? No husband, no kids, no mortgage. You're working remotely anyway, so why not stay here where you're needed?" The words hit me like a slap. I couldn't believe he'd just reduced my entire life to a list of things I didn't have. "I have my career," I said firmly. "I have my friends, my independence, my life. I've worked hard to build that, and I'm not just going to give it up." He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You say that like I'm asking for some huge sacrifice. I'm not. I'm asking you to think about what's best for both of us. This house could be your home, not just mine. And with you here, I wouldn't have to hire anyone to help out. It makes sense." "No, it doesn't," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "What you're asking me to do is give up everything I've worked for so I can be your live-in caregiver. That's not fair." His expression darkened. "Caregiver? Is that what you think this is? I just want my daughter close. Is that so terrible?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. "It's not terrible to want your family close, but it's terrible to manipulate someone into staying by lying about your health." "Oh, here we go again with the manipulation," he said, throwing his hands up in frustration. "I didn't manipulate you. I needed you, and you came. That's what families do. They show up." "Yes, they do," I said, my voice shaking. "But they also respect each other's lives. They don't guilt trip or lie to get what they want." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was heavy with unspoken tension. Finally, he said, "You're being selfish." That word, selfish, was the final straw. "Selfish?" I said, standing up from the table. "I dropped everything to come here because I thought you were dying. I put my life on hold, left my job, and rearranged everything for you. And now you're asking me to give it all up permanently, and I'm the selfish one." He stood too, his face red with frustration. "You're my daughter. I shouldn't have to justify wanting you here. I've done everything for you, and now you're acting like staying here is some kind of prison sentence." "I love you, Dad," I said, my voice trembling, "but I can't sacrifice my life for yours. That's not fair to me." His shoulders slumped, and for a moment, he looked more defeated than angry. "So that's it, then? You're just going to leave me here, alone, to fend for myself?" I hesitated, guilt tugging at me. "I'm not abandoning you," I said softly, "but I can't stay here forever. You have options. You can hire someone to help. You can ask other family members. But I can't be the only one holding everything together." He didn't respond, just stared at me with a mixture of hurt and anger. Finally, he muttered, "Fine, do whatever you want." I left the table, retreating to my room and shutting the door behind me. My hands were shaking, and tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. As much as I hated the fight, I knew I'd done the right thing. For so long, I'd let his guilt trips and manipulation dictate my actions. But this time, I'd drawn a line. And even though it hurt, I knew it was the only way to take back control of my life. The days after our confrontation were some of the most uncomfortable of my life. My dad wasn't one for silent treatments, but he became a master of it almost overnight. At first, I thought he just needed time to process what I'd said, but it quickly became clear that he was stewing, and he wasn't going to let me off the hook easily. Breakfasts turned into awkward silences, with him flipping through the newspaper and refusing to acknowledge my presence. The few times he did speak, it was to make pointed comments that cut deeper than I wanted to admit. "Must be nice," he said one morning as I cleared the dishes, "to be able to walk away from your responsibilities without a care in the world." "I'm not walking away from anything," I said, trying to stay calm. "Could have fooled me," he muttered, not even looking up. The real blow came when I started getting calls from other family members. First, it was my Aunt Susan. "I just got off the phone with your dad," she said, her voice dripping with disapproval. "He says you're leaving him high and dry." "What's going on? My name?" "He needs you." I sighed, rubbing my temples. "He's not helpless, Aunt Susan. He just doesn't want to take care of himself." "That's not what he says," she replied sharply. "He says you're abandoning him, and after everything he's done for you. You know how hard things have been for him since your mom left. Don't you think he deserves a little help?" "I've been helping," I said, trying to keep my frustration in check. "But I can't give up my entire life to stay here forever. He has other options. He just doesn't want to use them." "Well," she said, her tone icy, "I hope you can live with yourself." The calls didn't stop there. Cousins, uncles, even family friends reached out, all parroting the same narrative my dad had spun for them. I was the selfish daughter who had abandoned her poor, aging father in his time of need. At first, the guilt gnawed at me. I replayed our conversations over and over in my head, wondering if I'd been too harsh or if I should have handled things differently. But as the days went by, I started to see the situation for what it was. My dad wasn't just disappointed. I could have lived with that. He was weaponizing his disappointment, using it to turn others against me and paint himself as the victim. It was manipulation on a whole new level, and I refused to let it dictate my actions. I reminded myself that his situation wasn't my fault. He wasn't helpless. He was stubborn. I'd offered him solutions, like hiring a caregiver or asking other family members for help, but he dismissed them all because they weren't what he wanted. What he wanted was control over me, and I wasn't willing to give it to him. Eventually, I made the decision to leave. I spent my last few days at the house packing up my belongings and tying up loose ends. My dad barely acknowledged me, though I could feel his disapproval radiating from across the room. The night before I left, I tried to have one final conversation with him. "Dad," I said, sitting across from him at the kitchen table, "I know you're upset, and I'm sorry for how things turned out, but I can't stay here. I hope one day you'll understand." He didn't look at me, just stared down at his coffee cup. "I understand plenty," he said finally. "You've made it clear where your priorities are." "That's not fair," I said, my voice trembling. "I've done everything I could to help you, but I can't give up my life to make yours easier." He didn't respond. The next morning, I loaded my car and stood in the driveway, taking one last look at the house I'd grown up in. My dad stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Take care of yourself," I said, my voice softer than I expected. "You too," he said, though the words felt hollow. As I drove away, I felt a mix of sadness and relief. Leaving wasn't easy. It never is when family is involved, but I knew I'd done the right thing. For too long, I'd let guilt and obligation dictate my choices. Now, for the first time, I was choosing myself. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine to navigate. And that, I realized, was worth everything I'd left behind. It had been a few months since I left my dad's house and returned to my own life. At first, I felt a constant tug of guilt, an echo of his disappointed words lingering in my mind. Even though I knew I'd made the right decision, walking away from someone you love, even for your own well-being, was harder than I'd imagined. I threw myself into rebuilding my life, picking up the pieces of my career and reconnecting with friends I'd neglected during my time away. Slowly but surely, the ache of leaving began to fade, replaced by a sense of relief and freedom. Then, one afternoon, I got a call from a family friend, Mrs. Parker, the neighbor who'd been a second mother to me growing up. She'd always been kind and supportive, even during the recent drama, so I was happy to hear from her. "Hi, dear," she said warmly. "Just wanted to check in and see how you're doing. I ran into your dad the other day, and he mentioned you'd moved back to the city." My heart skipped a beat at the mention of my dad. "Yeah," I said cautiously. "I moved back a few months ago. How's he doing?" "Oh, he's doing great," she said, her voice cheerful. "He's got a part-time caregiver now. Sweet girl, very efficient, and he's been going out with the guys again. They've got a regular poker night at the diner. It's like old times." I blinked, unsure if I'd heard her correctly. "Poker night?" She said. "He mentioned it when I saw him at the grocery store. Said he's finally getting back into the swing of things. Oh, and he's been working in his garden again. His roses are looking gorgeous this year." I sat there, stunned, as her words sank in. My dad, the man who'd insisted he was too weak to take care of himself, was thriving without me. He'd hired help, was socializing, and even gardening, things he claimed he couldn't possibly manage when I was there. When the call ended, I sat on my couch for a long time, processing what I just learned. Part of me felt angry at the lies, at the manipulation, at the months I'd wasted feeling guilty for leaving. But another part of me felt an odd sense of relief. For the first time, I saw the situation for what it truly was. My dad didn't need me. He'd never needed me. What he wanted was control. He'd fabricated a health scare, guilt me into coming home, and tried to convince me to stay, all because he couldn't handle the idea of me living my own life. And now that I was gone, he'd found a way to carry on just fine. In a strange way, the revelation gave me closure. It hurt to know how easily he'd lied to me, but it also freed me from the lingering guilt I'd been carrying. I'd spent so much time questioning whether I'd done the right thing by leaving, wondering if I'd abandoned him when he truly needed me. Now, I knew the truth. He hadn't been helpless. He'd been selfish. That night, I pulled out my journal and wrote a letter to my dad. Not one I planned to send, but one I needed to write for myself. "Dear Dad," I began, "I'm glad to hear you're doing well. I hope you found the peace and independence you were looking for, just like I've started to find mine. I've let go of the hurt and the anger because I know now that your choices aren't my responsibility. You're stronger than you think, and so am I." When I finished writing, I felt lighter than I had in months. The weight of his manipulation was finally gone, and I was ready to move forward, without looking back. Rebuilding my life wasn't as easy as unpacking my boxes and going back to work. For months, I felt like I was piecing together a puzzle with missing pieces, trying to remember who I was before my dad's elaborate scheme turned my world upside down. I started small. I reorganized my apartment, creating a space that felt like mine again. I made lists of the things I'd neglected while I was away, projects, hobbies, friendships, and tackled them one by one. It was slow progress, but each step forward felt like reclaiming a part of myself I'd almost forgotten. Work was the hardest adjustment. I'd taken a leave of absence to care for my dad, but coming back felt like stepping into a room where the air had shifted. My colleagues were kind, but they asked questions I wasn't ready to answer. "How's your dad?" they'd ask, their expressions concerned. "Are you doing okay?" "I'm fine," I'd say with a polite smile, quickly changing the subject. It was easier than explaining the truth. What helped most were my friends. One evening, my best friend, Anna, dragged me out for drinks at our favorite bar. "You've been cooped up long enough," she said, handing me a glass of wine. "It's time to rejoin the world." I laughed, feeling the tension in my shoulders start to ease. "You're right," I admitted. "I've been stuck in my head lately." As we talked, I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't expected. I told her about the lies, the guilt trips, and the moment I realized I had to leave. "You did the right thing," Anna said firmly. "Your dad loves you, but love isn't supposed to come with strings attached. You have every right to live your life." Her words stayed with me long after that night. For so long, I'd let guilt shape my decisions, but now I was learning to set boundaries. Loving my dad didn't mean sacrificing myself, and that realization felt like freedom. Eventually, I reached a point where I could talk to my dad again without feeling the weight of everything that had happened. Our conversations were brief and polite, usually about mundane things like the weather or his garden. "Did you know my roses won an award at the county fair?" he said proudly during one call. "Really?" I replied, genuinely impressed. "That's great, Dad." We didn't talk about the past. Neither of us brought it up. Maybe it was because we didn't know how to address it, or maybe we were both afraid of reopening old wounds. Either way, I was okay with the distance. Our relationship was different now. I'd stopped looking for the father who had all the answers, the one who could fix anything. Instead, I saw him for who he really was, a flawed person, just like me, doing his best to navigate life. As the months passed, I felt myself growing stronger. I started saying no more often, not just to my dad, but to anyone who tried to push me beyond my limits. At work, I set clearer boundaries, refusing to take on tasks that weren't mine to carry. In my personal life, I surrounded myself with people who valued me for who I was, not what I could do for them. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. I'd be lying if I said I didn't still feel pangs of guilt or moments of doubt. There were times when I missed the closeness I used to have with my dad, back when I thought our relationship was simpler, but I knew that my decision to leave wasn't just about him. It was about choosing myself. And for that, I had no regrets. Now, as I sit in my apartment surrounded by the life I've rebuilt, I feel a sense of peace. The experience with my dad taught me hard lessons about love, manipulation, and boundaries, but it also showed me how resilient I am. I still love my dad, and I know he loves me in his own way. But love doesn't mean losing yourself for someone else. It means finding a balance, one that honors both your needs and theirs. For the first time in years, I found that balance, and I'm not letting go.